Fire Emblem Awakening. Man, what a game! Just about any and all Fire Emblem fans have played it, and it's without a doubt one of the most popular and important games in the history of the franchise, as well as one of my favourites. Despite its huge success, the game has its fair share of flaws, and there was one particular element that seemed rather lacking and something many players including myself have noticed upon repeated playthroughs. Aside from how unbalanced power-up and reclassing is, the map design that isn't winning any awards, starting the waifu emblem trend, shifting towards more anime cliche characters, as well as the worst case of respawning units inside of an old school NES side-scroller. Why do I like this game again? The story of Awakening sucks. Okay, sucks is a bit harsh, let's just call it underwhelming. As in my opinion, the game had an incredibly jumbled plot with minimal amounts of world building, one-note villains, a severe lack of urgency, considerably underdeveloped themes and characters, as well as a massive step back from what the previous entries have been able to provide. Well, at least it couldn't get any worse, right? While I do think the narrative is one of the weakest aspects of the game, it's not without merit, as there were a lot of concepts and ideas I thought were considerably interesting and could make for a much stronger story if explored further or taken in a different direction, which is precisely why we're here today. So join me everyone, as I once again try to fix what 2/3 of the 3DS Fire Emblem games couldn't seem to get right, as I offer up my own guide on how to improve Fire Emblem Awakening's story. And please keep in mind that these changes are purely based on my own personal preference and ideologies, nothing more. And if you've seen my videos about improving either Fire Emblem Fates or Sword Art Online, then this will work pretty much the same way, so spoiler warning for those who haven't played Awakening, which I highly doubt at this point. So, let's get to it. Step 1. Triple Trouble. Fire Emblem Awakening's plot is split up into 3 main arcs, beginning with Plegia, moving on to Valm, and finally ending with Grima over the course of a 25 or so chapter game. And here's where the problems begin. Because Awakening was trying to tell 3 stories in the same amount of time it takes most Fire Emblem games to tell just one, I couldn't help but feel each arc was incredibly bare bones and dull, with every event that happened and plot twist being insultingly predictable, made worse by the fact that the game rarely, and I mean rarely, took the time out to establish its world and history, in addition to criminally underplaying most of its characters and various themes. I believe it's safe to say the easiest way to solve this issue is to simply remove 2 of the story arcs and focus on just one. However, because of how certain plot threads tie into one another, I'm confident that having multiple story arcs can still work. 2 to be precise, as I feel it would give each narrative enough time to be at least proficiently explored. And keep in mind, this wouldn't be the first time the series has handled more than one story in a single game. After all, Genealogy did it and succeeded, for the most part. Concerning which 2 arcs to feature, well, when push comes to shove, I personally would have it that Plegia and Grima stay, but Valm goes. The reason being that Plegia to me had the most meat to it, and Grima is essentially the reasoning behind everything that happens and is from my perspective, otherwise vital to this game. That being said, Valm does contain elements and characters that I find interesting and could still make for a good story, plus considering its connection to Fire Emblem Echoes, it could serve as a nice way to tie the 2 games together. 4 to be precise, but let's stay focused, shall we? Step 2. Sins of the Past. On the surface, the story of Plegia sounds like your typical Fire Emblem narrative. Stop the bad guy from taking over the kingdom and put an end to the war. Been there, done that. However, what makes this setup so special is one particular factor surrounding the conflict, which revolves around how Chrom's father desecrated Plegia and now they want revenge. Almost like a reverse of Radiant Dawn Part 1. Sounds cool, right? Well, sad to say, it doesn't amount to much, putting it lightly, and ends up being generic RPG story number 687. I believe the first and most important step into fixing this arc is to delve deeper into the history of both nations. World building is a key component of any story, and I believe it's crucial for Awakening to explain in detail the foundations of both Ylisse and Plegia, in addition the full extent of what Chrom's father was like and how the war he waged affected both nations. Ideally, I would like the events to be primarily recounted through those who were present when this took place, such as Emerin, Gangrel, Mustafa, Frederick, and other NPCs, showing various different interpretations of the incident and how each of them felt towards the outcome, which would really help to make the universe of Awakening feel more alive and genuine. After all, I imagine most Plegians would not be able to forgive Ylisse for what they did and understandably shun them at every turn. But there could also be a small few who admire what Emerin is trying to do and don't hold her in the same level of contempt. On the other side of the spectrum, the people of Ylisse could potentially be split on the subject, with some who see the Plegians as equals and deeply regret being involved in the war, and others who think the Plegians are beneath them and that Emerin is weak and feeble, going so far as to strip Plegia of all they have and push them to the point of desperation. Finally, there's getting an outsider's perspective, in this case Flavia and Basilio, as they have an otherwise unbiased viewpoint, which could allow for some more concrete accounts of what went down and how they felt in regards to the actions of either side, emphasizing that oh so lovely moral grey Fire Emblem is known for. Already, I think this would give the story a greater sense of scope and realism. Plus, given the subject matter at hand, there's a lot of different themes the narrative lends itself to, but I feel one of its strongest could be the cycle of revenge, especially if the narrative were to take, shall we say, a more radical turn. What I have in mind is for events to play out very much how they did originally, with Emblem wanting to look for a peaceful solution, but Gangrel just isn't having it, and has very much become a warmonger himself. The real tipping point occurs during Emran's death, as Chapter 10 made it clear that some of the Plesian army became demoralized by Emran's sacrifice, and yet Gangrel still wished to wage war, and has thus become no better than Chrom's father. Well, what say we take that idea one step further, and have Chrom quite literally take up the mantle. With Emran gone and Gangrel aggressively trying to conquer Elise, in retaliation, Chrom, out of pure anger and hatred, fights back full force, throwing diplomacy to the wind and doing everything in his power to take down not just Gangrel, but all of Plegia, disregarding the fact that a good chunk of the enemy now want nothing to do with the war. As the game goes on, Chrom conquers more and more of Plegia, bearing in mind Gangrel doesn't die in Chapter 11, with the devastation continually extending onto those who are innocent in all this, demonstrating how the cycle repeats itself, with Chrom being far too furious to listen to reason at this point. More on that later. As the game reaches the last couple of chapters, Chrom is finally confronted by the likes of, say, Lissa and Robin, who beforehand were far too grief-stricken to speak up, finally bringing Chrom to the realization that what he's doing is abolishing everything Emran worked so hard to achieve, and how he's become the very thing he hated, making for a noticeably darker narrative on why hatred must be overcome instead of letting it continuously spread. Take it from this guy, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. This could also allow Gangrel, who I originally thought was nothing more than a joke, to sort of become the Ashnod of this game. As for those who don't know, Ashnod is the villain of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, and was fueled purely by a lust for power. He didn't care for class or race, just that those who are strong will be the ones to rule, and by the end his ambition comes true, with Ike, a mere mercenary, being able to overthrow him and put an end to the Mad King's war. Wait just a second! I feel based on the turn of events I suggested, Gangrel could potentially go down a similar route, as starting out, though he is evil, we can identify with his motives being fueled by revenge, and at the very least discern his perspective. However, as the war goes on, it reaches the point where he only wishes to spread as much bloodshed as possible to both Elise and Plegia, making it clear that at the end of the day, only those who are strong can survive, and at their core, mankind are simply beasts, as well as going out of its way to purposely taunt and aggravate Chrom into following the same path, which actually does work for a while, further proving his point. In the end, it's thanks to the fact that Chrom was surrounded by the people who love him that he's able to see the error of his ways and not fall victim to hatred, which could make for a good parallel between the two and transform Gangrel in what I feel to be a rather contemporary villain and a victim of the cycle of revenge, instead of just a psychotic Looney Tunes character. Step 3. Shadows of Valentia. Valm was always the weakest part of Awakening, as to me, it felt like an unnecessary addition that didn't amount to much and ended up being more of a distraction if anything else. However, I do see a glimmer of hope with this tale, and I'll explain why. First and foremost, while I don't think this arc should be at the very start of the game, as I'd argue the initial events surrounding Marth, Plegia and Ferox are an otherwise essential part of Awakening, in my mind it should commence quite early on, let's say around Chapter 6. Once Valm enters the picture and Walhart has made his ambitions clear, Chrom, being the gung-ho swordsman that he is, goes forth to confront the enemy head-on despite Emran being against the idea. Things seem to go well at first, but then Valm instigates a very hefty advance, and Emran, seeing how great of an enemy Elise will be going up against, offers a peace talk that falls on deaf ears, leading her to suggest that they seek the aid of Plegia to combine forces. And if Gangrel supports her any evidence, he wouldn't be against the idea despite the horrors Chrom's father befell his people, which he gladly rubs in their faces. However, Chrom refuses to listen because of their recent power struggles and is confident he can defeat Valm alone, only to get his ass subsequently whooped, something he's used to at this point. As time passes, the situation goes from bad to worse, as both Elise and Plegia suffer great losses, eventually resulting in Emran once again losing her life in an effort to try and stop the fighting, at which point both armies rally together and cry out her name, forcing Chrom's hand and joining forces with Gangrel. After the alliance is formed, sure enough, they successfully push Valm back and even take the fight to them, which is where Sayori comes in and she joins the team in order to defeat Walhart after what he did to her people. That's the general gist of my idea, and truth be told, this route is not the one I'm most keen on. But for what it's worth, I think it's an overall solid premise and could make for a very epic story, starting out on a low note, but then escalating into a full-scale war with up to 3 nations banding together to defeat one giant empire. Why does this sound so familiar? Additionally, I think this could also allow 3 arcs to be worked into a single narrative without making it a completely underdeveloped mess, and even give certain characters the chance to go in a slightly different direction. After all, Gangrel could act as more of an anti-hero this time around, as the audience could initially sympathise with what happened to him and his people, and appreciate his help in fighting back against Valm. However, once the invasion begins, it could possibly give Gangrel the opportunity to assert his dominance and ravage Valm, with the resulting chaos affecting those who are innocent or forced to fight for Warheart against their will, because if you recall, Valm has only recently been conquered. As a matter of fact, here's an interesting idea. What if, like before, the army splits up to fight Warheart and Yenfei separately, with Gangrel being the one to face off against the skilled samurai, who after observing how Warheart is losing the war and learning of Seiri's growing resistance, instead offers to join Chrom and Gangrel and fight a common enemy, filling him in on the reasons for siding with the Conqueror in the first place. However, at this point, Gangrel has become consumed by bloodlust and vengeance. He instead kills Yenfei in cold blood, causing Seiri to either abandon or lose faith in Chrom, who as of this point still needs Gangrel's help to defeat Warheart, and is guilt-tripped into turning a blind eye a la Emran and his father. Furthermore, it could give Warheart the chance to actually live up to his title of the Conqueror, as he's meant to be this all-powerful force of nature, yet I recall only one instance where he actually does something legitimately threatening. Every other time, he might as well take Xander's place as a boss he's so pathetically easy. Well, now that the story has Valm as the focus, it could do a better job at conveying to the player the sheer power of this behemoth and the people he commands, especially during the beginning and mid-game. This would also be a good opportunity to expand upon his supports and the ideas of conquering nations to prevent future wars. After all, what if the reason he invaded in the first place was because of what happened with Chrom's father and how he knew at some point the two of them would be at each other's throats again? Or consider how his original plan was to seek out and destroy Plegia to prevent the resurrection of Grima. And on that note, Step 4. Praise be to Grima. Despite having to fight 2 separate armies, the ultimate villain in Fire Emblem Awakening was the fell dragon Grima, because God knows the final boss for Fire Emblem game just has to be a dragon. Now I believe this particular arc is vital to Fire Emblem Awakening, as it essentially sets the events in motion that cause Lucina to travel back in time and is responsible for all the conflicts and misfortunes that take place. Though I personally felt it was far too underplayed originally, despite the events of Chapter 13, and resulted in a rather rushed and disappointing finale, though I'm starting to think it's become a franchise trope at this point. Obviously, the foreshadowing and build-up needs to be stronger in order to invoke a real sense of dread and make the connection between each storyline feel more seamless. A simple way to do this is to have more scenes involving characters that follow Grima, or hearing his name drop more regularly throughout the story, but that's just the very basics. As for the Fell Dragon's role in the game, while in the context of the Plegia arc, I would preferably make it so that because of the previous war and how the people's spirits were broken, the cult that worshipped the Fell Dragon has grown considerably over the years, and by the time the new conflict breaks out, it has a significant influence over Plegia and its people. In fact, it could be that because of how much power the cult has, a certain someone was able to convince Gangrel to start this war in the first place and obtain the Fire Emblem. At the point of Emran's death and Chrom's brutal retaliation, the prayers and worship of the Fell Dragon would subsequently skyrocket, with Plegians now in desperation of a miracle because of what Chrom is doing, allowing for Grima's presence to spread, more risen to come about, and subsequently compelling Chrom to seek the power of the Fire Emblem, which is ironically needed for the Fell Dragon's resurrection, showing that Chrom's rage is only adding fuel to the fire, and oh boy is it going to explode in his face. In the case of Valm, like before, Grima could be what potentially draws Warheart to Ylisse, either seeking the power for himself to further his ambitions, or perhaps wishing to silence the cult and anything connected to it before they have a chance to resurrect the Fell Dragon. Either way, Grima could be what draws Valm to invade, and during the initial onslaught, the people become desperate for a miracle and continuously pray to the dragon. However, once the tables turn, then that's when it can really kick off, and the resulting victories could further the Plegians' belief in Grima's power, allowing the cult to grow and potentially spread among the people of Ylisse. By following any number of these scenarios, it's much easier to see how Grima's reputation and presence evolves throughout the story. However, the word of the Fell Dragon isn't just going to spread itself, and people cannot simply tweet about it, which is where Valadar and Aversa come in. These two were easily the worst villains in the game in my opinion, for various reasons, but now there's a chance for redemption by actually having them do something worth a damn. Whether it be Plegia or Valm, Valadar and Aversa from my perspective should be continually pulling the strings so that as much bloodshed as possible occurs, reaching the point where Chrom is forced to seek out the Fire Emblem to either defeat Warheart or Gangrel, which they eventually use for themselves. By having them primarily be in the shadows, we can fully grasp just how much power they have over all that takes place and govern each situation in their favour, For example, what if Aversa had to convince Gangrel with the promise of the complete and utter destruction of Ulysses, as his supports mentioned how he regrets starting the war but got carried away when the bloodshed began, which could give off the impression that if Aversa wasn't involved, perhaps he would never have gone that far in the first place. After all, she's able to provide him with reason to fight Chrom and turn the tables a la Chapter 9, giving him even more of an excuse to wage war. Alternatively, Valazar and Aversa could be the ones tempting Warheart to put down the Fell Dragon, as Fave's Labyrinth is where Grima originated and resides in Arcadia, and through both Gangrel and Exilus, they can learn about and regulate both armies to extend the war for as long as possible, thus warranting the use of the Fire Emblem to end it. Valazar in particular could use his connections to Robin to acquire any and all information regarding Chrom's plans and work around Lucina's interference with the original timeline, subconsciously compelling Robin to form strategies and perform actions he otherwise wouldn't for Valadar's benefit, which simultaneously could gradually clue Lucina in as to who is responsible for killing Chrom, portraying him as his maniacal puppet master and diabolical schemer, instead of the absolute worst WhatIf to date. Funny enough, this could also parallel with Aversa's story arc, as for those who don't know, Valazar kidnapped and brainwashed her, subsequently burning down her village and everyone in it. Well, what if because he's become so focused on reviving Grima and controlling Robin, his grasp begins to slip, and over the course of the story Aversa slowly regains her memories, breaking free by the end and seeking to either help stop Grima or give her life in the process. This would demonstrate the full extent of Valazar and by extension Grima's manipulation on all sides, and how even the villains have been wronged by them, as well as their ability to bring out the worst in people. In particular... Step 5. Chrom sequences. Something I find rather unfortunate about Fire Emblem Awakening is that our main man Chrom is in my opinion one of the weaker Fire Emblem lords, though he certainly isn't the worst. The main reason for this is that I felt Chrom never really stood out much or changed over the course of the story, particularly because once Gangrel is defeated, Chrom to me pretty much took a backseat to both Robin and Lucina becoming the centre of attention, thus ruining his chances of getting into Smash forever. For me personally, if Chrom wants to live up to the title of Fire Emblem Lord, what I propose is to follow up on what Gangrel said during Chapter 11, how they are both the same person deep down, because if you think about it, he's not entirely wrong. After all, Chrom doesn't hesitate to engage the enemy at the drop of a hat, and chooses to fight his enemies rather than exercise diplomacy or negotiation. Sound familiar? By taking this concept and building on it, I feel it would really benefit Chrom's character and the story if he were to become darker. I believe the key to this is to exaggerate his established personality traits of not caring for politics, being more carefree and selfless yet at the same time quick to anger and irrational, as well as preferring to resolve disputes through fighting. This would make Chrom's constant clashes with either Plegia or Varm despite Emrin's best effort more realistic given his behaviour, which in turn causes Warheart to retaliate harshly in an attempt to crush the little prince or forcing Gangrel to employ more despicable methods to achieve victory, such as kidnapping Emrin and having her executed, showing how Chrom's actions, while having good intentions, sometimes hurt more than help. In fact, once Emrin dies, Chrom going into a full-blown rage against Plegia I don't think would be too far-fetched and show just how far he will go to avenge his sister, even pushing the likes of Lissa and Frederick away and getting into fights with Robin and even Sumia, that bastard! When considering Varm, his stubbornness to talk things out with Gangrel and instead simply fight the enemy head on would eventually lead many of his troops to their death, as well as Emerin's, as he wasn't willing to be more diplomatic and let go of his hatred from the start, which could act as a serious blow to his morale. Even after the alliance is formed and they start fighting back, he still may lack the determination to lead the entire army, as he blames himself for what happened to his sister and believes he's not worthy of her ideals, allowing Gangrel's forceful nature and resolve to win over the hearts and minds of many soldiers and get away with whatever he wants. By doing this, the game is able to exhibit that while Chrom's heart is in the right place, he sometimes brings out the worst case scenarios, signifying that his actions have severe consequences and why he needs to change how he does things. At the same time, it's those closest to him that reinforce his strengths and bolster the best of Chrom either during certain chapters or support, allowing the player to see both extremes and the natural progression he takes from lad to lord. Picture, if you will, during roughly the mid-game, Chrom is desperate to defeat either enemy and seeks the Fire Emblem to do so. However, Tiki refuses to hand over the gemstone and declares him to be an insult to the brand. But when he eventually comes around and learns from his mistakes, she gladly hands it over, which to me would make it feel like Chrom has earned the honour of wielding the Fire Emblem. Now, I get the feeling this version of Chrom would admittedly become slightly unlikable at points, which is perfectly understandable, but I also feel he'd be a more unique character who has a genuine development cycle and a stronger chance of standing out amongst the crowd. Plus, it also means that the likes of the Shepherds, Lissa, Frederick, the Khans, Robin and Lucina would be vital in regards to his growth and evolution. Speaking of which... Step 6. A Lucina to the past. It's no secret that time travel is a big part of Awakening, and it uses the alternate/parallel world line theory, where Lucina's timeline and Chrom's are not one and the same, as she travels back in time to save his world, not her own. You'll be surprised at what you can learn by watching anime. This, in my eyes, makes Lucina the true main character of Awakening, and for what it's worth, I think she's one of the best lords in the series. But there's still some elements I'd like to add or adjust, one of which being the butterfly effect. More specifically, although she prevents certain casualties and world-altering events, in certain instances, things end up turning out for the worst. This is a very broad concept that can apply to just about any part of the story. One example I'd like to present is that because Lucina prevented the Exile's original death in Chapter 6, Gangrel felt the need to bolster his attack, and as a result, Cordelia's allies end up dying. Or let's look at how because Emblem was alive, which led to the events of Chapter 9, Philia, in an attempt to rescue her, is slaughtered by the Risen Archers. Why stop there? What if we take the idea I had for the Val arc and say that Lucina helps Chrom defeat Warhot's army at the very early stages, hoping to drive them back as quickly as possible. He feels even less of a need to ask Plegia for help, but it's precisely because Lucina helps him win early on that Warhot fights back so much harder, which Lucina didn't foresee. And in the end, Emran still dies, and Chrom gives in to forming the alliance. But at this point, his spirit is so broken that he can't lead the army, allowing Gangrel to become too power-hungry, ravage Varm, and go so far as to kill Yenfei, something that didn't happen in her timeline if a certain paralogue is any evidence. There are a wide number of possibilities with this idea, but overall I think it would make for some interesting themes about how much one person should interfere with the past, as well as how strong the repercussions are. Furthermore, Lucina's presence in the past could drastically change how events play out, testing Lucina's resolve and giving her more obstacles to overcome, as she would essentially be shooting in the dark and have to rely on her own skills instead of preemptively knowing future outcomes. I once again refer you to Emran's death in Chapter 9, as perhaps because Lucina stopped it once before, at this point Chrom was desperately hoping Robin's rescue plan would go smoothly, only for it to utterly fail, and since Chrom's world has come crashing down, he takes the dark turn I described earlier. By doing so, we can see how everything Lucina does isn't always for the best, and I think it would be a real challenge for Lucina to see her father at his worst, which could make for some really good drama and cause her to contemplate everything she's known up until this point. At the same time, her ability to persevere through all these hardships could help to strengthen her character and be a key factor in regards to helping Chrom see the error of his ways, showing her progression from working behind the scenes and trying to do everything alone, to fighting alongside the others and letting people into her life. I mean, wouldn't it be brilliant if it's precisely because Lucina is in the past and changed history that Chrom's relationship to his friends became stronger, and as a result he doesn't die at Robin's hands? Or better yet, what if because of how deplorably Chrom behaves, Lucina becomes so upset that Robin ends up being the one she finds solace in, and when she realizes that she has to kill Robin to save Chrom, it's absolutely heartbreaking for her and would actually make for a very tough decision. By going down this route, the game can simultaneously show the flaws in Lucina's character and also exemplify her strengths, as well as having possibly some of the most tender moments in the game, like say some additional scenes with whoever Lucina's mother is, as she would undoubtedly need someone to talk to considering how bad things get, with her mother being the one who reassures her that she's doing the right thing, and why she married Chrom in the first place, along with the reasons as to why all the other shepherds follow him, which leads me to my final point. And finally, step 7, a third-party perspective. I find that the best types of Fire Emblem stories are the ones where the secondary characters are quite involved in the narrative in order to spice things up and offer some interesting perspectives on the situation. Awakening's involvement of its secondary characters is in my opinion rather minimal, which is a shame because I think the cast is great and could have really added to the story if given a bit more screen time, especially in regards to the narratives I have put forth, considering there is a heavy focus on having the shepherds rekindle both Chrom and Lucina's spirits. Now, some characters I can see acting a certain way regardless of which story arcs are followed. For instance, I'd imagine most if not everyone would initially be on board with fighting back hard against Plegia or Varm after Emran's death. Though after a while, people like Sully and Vake would confront Chrom about how he has gone too far and all the damage he is doing, or growing a spine and not letting Gangrel walk all over him. I could very easily see Pane reaffirm that Chrom's actions are precisely the reason why she cannot trust Manspawn. Cordelia could potentially snap at the fact that her friends died for Emran's sake, and what Chrom is doing is pretty much spitting on their graves, you get the idea. Also, depending on whether Plegia or Varm is the focus of the story, wouldn't it be cool if Faja and Henry, or Virion and Shursh respectively, became more involved because they hail from either nation? I get the feeling it would make for some interesting interactions. By allowing the secondary characters to voice their opinions throughout the game, it could make for some powerful drama and help cement their importance to the story. However, there's one person in particular that I've been avoiding up until now, the waifu magnet himself, Robin. Now personally, I always thought Robin was featured a little too much in Awakening and took a lot of attention away from the main lords, along with not giving most of the secondary characters any time in the spotlight. Jesus, Robin, you have your own amiibo figure, are playable in both Smash and Warriors, 2 Holidays Heroes variants, what more do you want, you greedy bastard? Well, since both the major and minor characters would get more screen time, I would see to it that Robin has more of a supporting role rather than a major one. That's not to say he can't be involved in the story. After all, who else is going to help plan Chrom's next move because of how intense the war becomes, as well as being the one to keep Lucina and the rest of the team's spirits high, making Robin act as more of the observer, which I feel would do a better job of fulfilling the role of the avatar template for the player to insert themselves. In fact, one idea I had in mind would be to give Robin and the other shepherds exclusive guiding chapters or paralogs where Chrom and Lucina aren't playable, such as small skirmishes or clearing out Risen, and during those missions different aspects of Awakening could be further explored, such as more details about what Chrom's father did, Grimmer's cult, Emran's reign, making connections to both Arcanea and or Valentia, you name it. I feel this would be a wonderful opportunity to delve more into Awakening's lore as well as characters' backstories and how they correlate to what is going on and continually blur the morality spectrum. Picture, if you will, a full recap of how the Tugwell were hunted to near extinction, which would better explain Panay's distrust of humans. What if because of how desperate Plegia became because of the previous Exalt's massacre, that they started forcing children to learn the dark arts at such a young age, with Faja being one of the victims of this and why she's so antisocial? On a lighter note, perhaps it's because of how Chrom and Lissa didn't care for nobility that inspired Vague and Maribel to join the Shepherds in the first place, and how it changed them for the better. Maybe we can find out exactly why Sumia and Cordelia are so fond of Chrom, all of which isn't necessary mind you, but would allow for additional insight into the world and characters of Fire Emblem Awakening, with Robin and thus the player being the one to see and experience it all. Throughout this video, I've done my best to put forth ideas that could improve Awakening's story from my perspective, many of which are rather dark and drastically different to the original plot, which I'm sure won't sit well with some of you, and I perfectly understand why you would feel as such. However, it's precisely because the story is so intense and goes out of its way to demonstrate the heroes at their worst, that being able to see and experience everyone rally together and remain positive in the harshest of times, to me would make the journey that much more memorable and engaging, showing that life won't always go your way. Actions have dire consequences. What you think is right might not be for the best. How people change once they are pushed past the breaking point. How much the truth can hurt. Why letting go of the past is so difficult, and how the world can seem like it's always against you. Yet it's the people closest to us that keep us going forward. The ones who pick us up when we fall down. Those willing to put up with us even when we turn them away because they know who we really are. The lengths they will go to make us happy. The way they motivate and encourage us to better ourselves each and every day. How even the smallest of gestures can make a world of difference, and no matter what mistakes we make or how astronomical the odds may be, as long as we keep pushing forward and never give up, any challenge can be overcome, so long as the people we love remain by our side and in our hearts. And that, my friends, is something I like to call Fire Emblem. And that's my guide on how I would improve Fire Emblem Awakening's story. I hope you all enjoyed the video because boy, this one was a doozy, and feel free to tell me your thoughts in the comments and how you would go about improving Awakening's story, because I'm fascinated to know how you would take this concept in a different direction. If you enjoyed this video, then why not give How to Improve Fire Emblem Fate's story a watch, or How to Improve Sword Art Online, and I hope you enjoy either of them. Also be sure to hit that like button and subscribe as well. Anyway, that's it from me, I'll see you all next time.